All right, hi guys, welcome to this week's workshop. So this week was the kind of third ranked topic, I guess from the Doodle poll a couple of weeks ago, and the topic is on hydrodynamics. So I think first off, don't let the word scare you. It's basically looking at how we move and interact with the water. I will definitely start off with this workshop with this statement that this has been quite a challenging topic just in terms of putting some structure to it, and it's definitely challenged me in terms of really thinking about what the important information is, and hopefully as we move forward through this video how I put it across and trying to make it as simple as possible. You can look at the word hydrodynamics and kind of it could scare people away to an extent, but it's really not that complicated, and hopefully I can make it relatively simple. And like I said, it's been quite a challenge for me as well to put it together and just to test my knowledge and thoughts on the subject. So yeah, I'm not gonna through this one. It can get very bogged down in science. I'm going to try not to do that. So I will try and just move quite quickly through the whole thing and see where it takes us. So like I said, this week's topic: hydrodynamics, how we interact with water. So moving forward straight away. So I think there's just a couple of key little bits here just in terms of understanding swimming as a sport fundamentally. And there's three kind of key points I just wanted to kind of talk through. And that first one is swimming is obviously a very unnatural action for human beings to undertake. It's one of the only sports or one of the only kind of activities that we do where we need to have pretty much instruction from the very first stroke that we take. From when we first jump in the water, we need to have a lot of supervision, to when we learn to swim. Like basically every stroke you do gets checked and scrutinized and corrected to an extent. So it is very unique in that respect of the sports or the movements, like running, for example. You don't see babies looking for permission to try and walk, if that makes sense, or needing expert supervision to be able to help them to get to walk. So that's just a bit of an example. The second kind of point there is obviously with us swimming in water, moving through quite a dense medium such as water, every action that we do is highly important to reducing resistance as we move through it. And that's something from a technical point of view that, while we don't cover that in this video technique specifically, a lot of this conversation today is going to kind of lead up to understanding the foundation of why we need to have great understanding of how we move through the water to have great technique, and then why technique is so important. And then there's a couple of little things at the bottom, just understanding kind of how swimming's progressed, especially in this manner. That I've kind of put some key facts, I guess. That since 1896, when the Olympics swimming was first introduced to the Olympic Games, it has changed significantly. So the first Olympic Games, it was all open water pools. Obviously now we swim in 50-meter pools that are specifically heated to a certain temperature. They're a certain specific depth to allow for the waves that are created by the swimmers to travel the right distance before they get hit back. Suit fabrics that we use are very different. Obviously, in 2009, for example, there was a ban in terms of the technical suits that were designed, and then we've gone back to essentially designs that were a little bit more akin to what we had in the late 90s, early 2000s. But obviously that's changed quite a lot. Lane lines or lane ropes weren't introduced in racing in the Olympic Games until 1924. Race starts weren't allowed until 1936, and goggles weren't actually introduced in racing until the late 1970s. So that's just a little bit of an insight as to some of the key ways that swimming has changed, and some of this is influenced, or does have an influence on the speed in which we swim, and obviously how we look at the way we move through the water. So moving forward a little bit, so just a little bit of an image as to swimming now and then. You look at the top right image there, that's what swimming in the 1900 Olympics looked like. It was more open water, there was no lane lines. You can't see the costumes that they're wearing, but I think men and women both wore the shoulders down to knees bodysuits. Almost look like those stripy ones that you see in old movies with people wear when they go to the beach in old movies. So very different to what we had down here in 2016 in Rio, down in the bottom right, obviously with the lane lines, very specific depth and temperature of the pool. spectator seating that is by far surpassing anything that was in the 1900s, and definitely want to point out the sheer amount of media, which is something that often gets forgotten, I think, with that level of competition, that you do have to deal with the media in a lot of different ways. So yeah, that's just a bit of an insight as to then and now. So a couple of key focus points. What is hydrodynamics? Okay, so first point is it's the principle of how water interacts with the body as it moves and the force acting upon the body. Okay, so as the body moves through the water, it's looking at how water interacts with us as humans, and then also the forces that we apply onto it, how that then has an effect on how we move through the water. And the second point there is hydrodynamics examines how water flows around a swimmer, which we'll cover in a minute, and the forces produced and how that can impact our use of energy when we swim. Now, I just want to say this quickly, that this is one of the key points at the end of this presentation. It's something that I want to build up to, that a lot of you don't have to specifically sit there and be able to recount all of the information about different types of drag or whatever it is. That's not the relevant point to all of this. What's relevant is that just giving yourself an understanding of how it works, and then that allows you to understand how you interact with the water and how you make yourself more streamlined in any situation, whether it's in an actual streamlined position or whether it's in a swimming stroke or a start or a turn, whatever it is. How you interact with the water and how you think about that and how you manage it will change and develop, which then gives you the ability to help manage your energy better. And that is something that we'll cover later on. And that is such an important factor in swimming. And I think in racing terms, in tactical conversation, how we manage energy is probably one of the most important parts of that. But also one of the things that is not talked about enough, if that makes sense. So moving forward, so simple little picture here. Key focus point is, what are the main forces that act on me when I swim? Now, I'm not going to spend mountains of time going through all of the different areas of this, but we'll go through the basics. So you got 4 different key points. You've got your thrust, your uplift, your mass, and your drag. Okay, so the basic principles there are that the thrust, which is this one, it's the positive force that's moving you forward. So the force that you apply when you pull through the water, when you're trying to move forward, that produces thrust, and it's a positive force that moves you towards where you want to go, which is the other end of the pool. Then you've got drag, which is going the opposite way, which is the equal and opposite force that you get from trying to create thrust or propulsion when you swim. So drag is the negative force that acts on you, and it moves backwards as you move through the water. Okay. The upside, so this bit at the top here, that is a combination of the buoyancy of the water and a small element of lift from the stroke. So the lift from the stroke comes from, depending on what part of the pole you are, whether it's on freestyle, breaststroke, backstroke, or any of the strokes, there is a certain amount of lift that does come from it. Even though you aren't actively trying to lift yourself out of the water, you will produce a lift factor that combines itself with buoyancy of the water to give you a little bit of upwards movement, okay, and keeps you at the surface of the water, which is where we want to be. And then obviously the down bit, which is the swimmer's weight, so your mass, essentially. So you've got 2 forces that are acting with each other, and you've got 2 forces that are acting with each other the opposite way as well. And hopefully I'm right in recounting this, but I think it's Newton's third law, which is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And when you look at thrust and drag, that's absolutely true. The more thrust that you create, or the more speed you create, the drag increases equally with it. Hopefully I'm correct in saying that. I'm sure I'll have a senior swimmer correct me if I'm wrong or mistaken. Okay, so looking a little bit at how does water surround me as I swim. So in terms of when you move through the water, you've got 2 types of ways that the water flows over you. You've got steady flow, you've got unsteady flow, okay? Now, the diagrams here should give you a pretty good understanding of what this means. It's not an overly hard concept, but when you've got steady flow, your limbs or your body is moving at a consistent speed with no change of direction. So the example being in a streamlined position, which if you look at the picture on the left, is exactly what's being depicted. In a nice streamlined position, you can see the water moving over the body in a nice steady fashion, no massive changes in direction or anything like that, or sudden movements from the swimmer. So you do get a nice steady flow of water. Okay, now it is worth mentioning that there is a speed limit to this that, I think from the research I did, I can't remember what the measurement is, but it didn't give an actual speed in meters per second, but there is a meter per second limit, or there will be a meters per second limit as to how fast you go in streamline position before you do start creating some unsteady flow, irregardless of whether you're in that streamline or not. But generally, from our perspective, we will never swim fast enough to be able to create an unsteady flow in a streamline position, if that makes sense. You know, we will always have that steady flow going. So, and then the opposite of that is the unsteady flow. So as your hands and your feet, so thinking about a pull or a kick, accelerate or change direction quickly, unsteady flow is created to produce thrust. So you need to have unsteady flow to create thrust or propulsion forwards. And you can think of that as whenever you do an actual swimming action, so any of the strokes or a pull or a kick, you will be creating unsteady flow to an extent. Okay, obviously depending on if you're pulling, it's going to be coming from up front. If you're kicking, it's going to be coming more from the back end, and also then it depends on what position you're kicking in. But that's the way that water generally, what it does when it moves around a swimmer. It goes in two ways: steady flow or unsteady flow. Hopefully that makes some sense. Okay, so look at water resistance. So the key points here: when your body moves through water, there's always some resistance to overcome, okay? So that is obviously known as drag, okay? So you can see in these two pictures that I put on the left-hand side here, you've got the bottom one, where if we go back to this first one, you've got the streamline position going on. Ooh, no, too far. You've got the steady flow. It says laminar flow, laminar flow, sorry, laminar. That is essentially what steady flow is. That's the technical term for it. Okay, it comes over the body, you got steady flow, and because you're in a nice tight streamline position, there are elements of drag that start occurring and creating resistance, but they're not as hot, not particularly high. Okay, but if you look at the top one, you got the body that's out of position, the head's up, the palms are, the wrists are dropped down, the feet are down, and you can see already just with the amount of vortices or disruptions in water that happen on this particular picture, that you can see what happens, and you can probably in your own mind know exactly what that would feel like in the water if you were using that position. So, you know, while no matter what speed you move at, you're always going to have some level of resistance as you move through the water. The position that you're in has a drastic effect on how much resistance it creates or causes. Okay. So the second point, the larger the surface presented, or the surface area of the body presented, the greater the drag force. And that is, again, very well illustrated in these two images. If you were to look straight on from where my mouse is and look towards the body of this swimmer here, you would see, obviously, their hands in front, but a very slim profile from their shoulders down, and you probably wouldn't even be able to see their feet because they're directly behind the head, but it would be a very slim profile that you could see. So if you think about the water going towards that, there's not a huge amount of surface area for the water to hit and cause additional drag. But then if you look at the top one, if the head was up, the feet were down, if you would again look at that from the front, you'd see their feet down, their heads up, the surface area significantly increased, and obviously that would logically increase the force of drag that is presenting to the swimmer. Okay, and then the final point there, obviously the faster you move through the water, the more drag you need to overcome. And we've already mentioned this in the previous slide, that if we look at Newton's third law, for every action is an equal and opposite reaction. So for every bit of thrust that we create, there is an equal amount of drag that comes along with that. And we need to overcome those drag forces if we are to maintain our speed. And this is where we start linking it to energy later on, that in order to overcome that drag, we need to use energy to be able to push through that water and move it out the way, essentially. And by doing so, we do use that energy. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense so far. Like I said, this is even a challenge for me to make sure that I'm trying to portray the right info. Right, so different types of drag. Okay, now there are three different types. The first one is skin friction drag. Okay, so skin friction drag is the interaction between your skin and the water. Now, as water passes over your skin, as soon as it hits the first layer of water that hits your skin, it sticks. Okay, and then as the water keeps coming over it, it essentially layers on, and the drag force becomes a little bit higher with the layers and layers and layers of water that ends up sticking to you. Okay, obviously it's not infinite, otherwise you'd have water layers coming off you. But that's essentially what happens with skin friction drag. It's about the water sticking to you initially, and then the resistance and the drag forces that get created on that next layer as the water flows over the top of that sticky layer, essentially. Okay. The higher skin friction causes more water to be dragged behind you. So essentially, the way that water comes off, you end up having a bit of a wake behind you, and that is a level of a level of drag there. Now, if I point you over to the diagram on the right hand side, you can see that right at the bottom there, you got swim speed, and even though I've cut it off on the picture by the looks of it, this is drag force. That's supposed to come up the left hand side. Skin drag is one of the least amounts of drag that we will feel. It's something that, in order, one of the reasons that swimmers shave down, for example, for major competition, is to try and, well, obviously it feels quite good when you do it, but it's trying to just reduce some of the effects of skin drag, which are relatively marginal, and you can see that by the very marginal nature of the red line there as to what skin drag actually does to you. But it's something that's worth looking into as you get older. Things like shaving down, it makes a small difference. It's not the be all and end all, but it's the little things that make the difference in the end when you go to major competition. And I just put a little note there that technical suits. Now, the technical suits that were banned in 2009, one of the reasons that they were is that they definitely helped reduce the levels of skin friction drag because of the material that they were made of. The water didn't stick to them as well, and it was a little bit, there wasn't that layer of water stuck to the suit that then had the next layer washing over it and creating more friction and drag as it went over the top of it. So those suits, one of the reasons they were banned, only one of the reasons, was that it was reducing down some of the drag that the swimmer was experiencing, which is, it's arguable as to how that particular skin friction part was effective, because it's such a minimal part, but it was definitely a part of it. The second one is pressure drag. Pressure drag is the difference in pressure from the front to the back of the body. All right. So it's high pressure at the front, low pressure at the back. And if I quickly just bring you back to this previous slide, you can see on here that in a really good streamline position. Now, even if it wasn't just streamline, the action streamline, or even if it was a stroke, the more streamlined you are, the more high pressure you're moving from at the front, and the low pressure area is more out the back, which generally gives you much better water to move through. It's not as turbulent, okay? But if you look at the top end here, now the worse your streamline position is, the high pressure is still up front because of the steady flow that's coming towards it. But you'll notice that the low pressure area, which is represented, or they call it the boundary of separation. So essentially where the high pressure starts converting to low pressure, essentially, it's much higher at the top end of the body. And as you go down, the lower pressure area is obviously still at the back, but with this line down here, it's such a large pressure difference. It's high, and then it suddenly goes high to low in a much larger scale than down here, where you've got much less time from it changing from high to low pressure, if that makes some sense. Hopefully, because it does take a minute to get your head around it. Okay, so this pressure drag is the difference between the front and the back of the body, essentially, that little space between it. And as you can see on the graph, that pressure drag, in terms of correct body position, has a much bigger effect on overall drag forces created when you swim than skin friction drag does. So it is a much bigger factor. Now, moving on though to the biggest factor in all of this is something called, and the third one called wave making drag, or wave drag, let's call it that. And wave drag is the energy needed to push the water out of the way as you swim, allowing energy to be used for propulsion. Okay, so if we skip our way back a little bit to this little point here, that obviously the faster you move through the water, the more drag you need to overcome. Obviously, it's Newton's first law. You've got to overcome that force that you're going into, and what that essentially means is you need to be using a high amount of energy to be able to do that. That's what you're actually burning in swimming, to overcome the drag created by the water, and much of that is down to your use of technique. Okay, So the kind of key points I think wraps this whole idea up of the different types of drag and why they're relevant. And especially if we focus in on the pressure drag, which is definitely down to our body position in the water. Skin friction drag, it's so small, and to be honest, it's one of those things that we can control to an extent by doing things like shaving down, but really we don't have a huge amount of control over it. But the pressure drag and the wave drag we do. Pressure drag, again, is about body position in the water, and the wave making drag is massively influenced by the quality of our technique and how we move through the water, okay? So the kind of final two key points that bring this together as to why pressure drag and wave drag have much more of an influence and much bigger factors in this is that when you look at those two, pressure and wave, this is where the need for proper technique comes in. To manage the pressure and the wave drag, you've got to be moving in the best possible way. So here, take an example of if you enter your water up front on a freestyle stroke and you just chop straight down and you present this huge forearm and hand position into the water, you're creating a significant amount of drag that's going to hit onto the body. That's going to be pressure drag, and the fact that the pressure that's coming at you is suddenly shifted from high to low very rapidly as you go down. So you're going to be slowing down in the process of that. And then when it comes to the wave drag, the amount of energy that it will take from that hit, it's almost like coming to a stop, and this is something I'll explain briefly in a second. You're essentially putting the brakes on because of that really high, heavy surface area that you're presenting to the water, and you're going to be coming to a stop, and you've got to use lots of energy to get that momentum back again. So this is where having really great technique and understanding of how you move through the water is important. And this is one of those things that it's one of those subjects that if you start understanding and focusing on how you feel when you move through the water, and knowing if a body part is over here rather than being here, or if your streamline is like this rather than being like this, if you notice the differences between those, it will make such a huge impact on the way that you swim in a race, in the energy that you have when you train, in how much easier it is for you to do a lot of different tasks in the pool, in comparison to if you don't understand it and you take these things for granted. And there'll be people out there that will go, oh well, no, I don't need to know anything about that. I'm not gonna bother. Well, actually, you're missing out in those opportunities to learn about how your body actually moves through the water, because with knowing it, it makes a huge difference. And then the final point there on that slide is just the faster you swim, the more critical great technique becomes. And we've already said, with increased propulsion and force and thrust, you get an equal amount of drag increasing at the same time. So the faster you swim, the best technique you've got to have in order to reduce down the amount of potential drag forces that are acting on you, because it will save you a lot of time and a lot of effort. Okay? Right, so this is kind of the final bit. So just how we use energy when we train, when we race, and when we swim. So two key points. Understanding drag helps us practically, allowing us to, oh no, am I reading that right? Oh yeah, of course, yeah, sorry, I'm having a bit of a moment there. So understanding drag it's massively practical, and it helps us understand how we move through the water. Essentially, it allows us to understand how we can move to be as efficient as we possibly can. There, finally got those words out. Had a bit of a brain fart moment there. Do apologize for that. So like I've already said, understanding the process of how we move through the water will help us become more efficient as we move through the water. Now, massive point to focus on here. Now, if we take two different events from two ends of the spectrum that still both require efficiency in their own way in terms of technique and the way that you apply force on the water. Okay, let's take the 1500 freestyle and the 50 freestyle, two different ends of the scale. Now, in a 1500 freestyle, your almost sole focus is on maintaining speed, which is generally slow, much slower than a 50 freestyle speed is, of course, but it's on maintaining speed, but being as efficient as you possibly can with your energy as you do so. Okay, that is basically what 1500 is all about. But then you look at the other end of the spectrum on the 50 free. Now, while what you need as a 50 freestyler, you need to have great efficiency of your movement, so you're hitting the right position every single time. You need to have great efficiency as to how you apply force and propulsion through the water. You've absolutely got to have that. But what a 50 freestyler does that is so different from a 1500 swimmer is that they don't need to be saving energy or to be using their efficiency to save their energy, because what your energy is going into as a 50 freestyle swimmer or in a 50 freestyle event or even a backstroke or fly or breaststroke is you're trying to get to your fastest speed as quickly as you can. Now that doesn't mean faster speed doesn't mean that you come up short doing minimal underwater kicks and poor streamline and just start spinning your arms. That's not how you achieve maximum speed. You achieve maximum speed by having great technique and great apply force into the water and how you move forwards, which is why we always emphasize quality of technique and controlled movement. But 50 freestyle is about getting to your maximum speed because of those technical components as quickly as you possibly can, and then simply maintaining it for the longest possible time. That is the goal of a 50 freestyler. You know, they don't need to swim 30 lengths. They need to swim 1. And they need to get to the highest speed as quickly as they possibly can in order to make sure that they can maintain that as well as possible throughout the race. Massive drastic comparison to a 1500 swimmer. Whereas, like I said, it's about efficiency of movement and saving energy as much as possible. Okay. So the second point is the amount of energy used increases as we swim faster. Okay. This is due to drag increasing at the same rate and us having to overcome this to maintain speed. Okay, so again, we talked about that overcoming speed bit again. You know, we need the energy that we've got stored in our cells in order to overcome the drag forces that we end up coming up against in the swimming race or in a training session. Okay, so if you've got poor technique, and let's just say on a streamlined position, instead of being head tucked in, your head's up, you're getting all that drag and you're slowing down, you're having to use a percentage of extra energy to get that speed back again so you can start moving. So let's just say you were next to somebody who had a great streamline and then you lifted your head, they would move ahead of you because they were maintaining speed better, not because they're trying any harder, because they're maintaining better body position. And then you would have to spend that energy just to catch them up again. Okay, you're having to use extra. So by the end of a race or a training session or whatever it is, the other person, if they're being more economical, they will have a bit more energy to utilize than maybe you would. And it's not about competing with other people for that particular reason. That is just a good example. Okay. Now, in terms of strokes, the most economical stroke is freestyle. Backstroke's not too far behind. And then obviously breaststroke and fly are the least economical strokes. So this is pretty much the last slide now. So last part of using energy, and I just want to use this example or this analogy of cars and traffic. So when you're in traffic in a car, you accelerate and you brake, and you're doing it quite often because you're speeding up, slowing down, depending on what's going on. There's an awful lot of energy being used to speed up and slow down. Okay. Now, if you think of it like this, if you're in a swimming race, and let's just say you're applying great force through your stroke at all times and you're moving really consistently and you've got really good body position, it's like being on an open motorway, cruising away at 70 miles an hour. Your movement is very economical. You're using energy obviously to move and overcome the drag forces, but it is not as much as it would be if you had a body position out of place, or if you were not pulling all the way through and out the back of your stroke and missing part of your pull. Those are just examples. If you were doing things like missing parts of your pull or moving a body position out of place, it would be like the final point. It's like being hit by traffic. You're stopping and starting. Every time you speed up, and then every time you slow down, using more and more energy to get started and stopped every single time. Okay, and this little graph here on the left, it's just a general kind of example as to just kind of understanding the economy of different strokes, and you can look at the different colors. So we got freestyle in blue, backstroke in yellow, breaststroke in green, fly in red. And if we just pick out the fastest speed here that you get on each of these, the energy expenditure is in oxygen use, but we won't go too much into the measurement of that. But you can understand the basic scale of from 10 to 110. It's increasing in energy usage essentially. So in order to swim 1.6 meters per second on freestyle, it takes, let's just put this in, it's in milliliters. So let's just utilize that. So let's just say it takes 70 milliliters of oxygen to swim at 1.6 meters per second on freestyle. You can obviously see on fly that is significantly higher. It's anywhere between 30 and 35 milliliters of oxygen extra just to go the same speed. And a lot of that comes down to the start-stop nature of what fly and breaststroke tends to be. It's not as fluent as backstroke and freestyle. And back and free, if you do them correctly, you don't have any real gaps in the stroke. You're always applying propulsion. You're applying quite a thin body profile to the water at all times. And, you're always moving forward nice and smooth. Now, breaststroke, with your arms extending out, which is part of the stroke, so you can't avoid most of this, but you are presenting a much bigger body profile to the water, which takes more energy to overcome that, which obviously you can see in the graph from the blue to the green. And then even on fly, just because of the general movement, where as you recover your arms in particular, and there's no propulsion happening at that moment in time, you're relying on propulsion you've already created from the acceleration out the back of the stroke and the kick to carry your arms forward. And, hence the fly, the name of the stroke, fly. You are having to use more energy to get those arms over to start the next stroke. So whilst fly is a powerful stroke, it's not overly economical in its use of energy. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. I think the cars in traffic analogy is quite a good one for thinking about how you apply force in your stroke and how you move accurately through the water. If you break streamline, if you aren't as tight as you possibly can be in your stroke and your technique, and you're not applying force evenly throughout your strokes, you are going to be going into that accelerate break waste of energy area. Whereas the better you hold water, the better you move it consistently and through the stroke, and the better you hold body position, the more it's like being on the open motorway, where everything is much more economical. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. So just to wrap it up, a couple of key points. Like I said at the beginning, I think it's important not to necessarily become an expert in this particular thing. It can be quite challenging, and sometimes the science can get very monotonous and bog you down a little bit with it. So this has been more about helping you just understand some of the basics, and even if you understand why it's important to move through the water effectively and consistently, then we've definitely moved on and we've taken something good away from this. The second point is that having great technique, it's not just about myself, Mike, Liam, or any of the other coaches telling you that you need to have great technique. Great technique helps you efficiently move through the water, and that's about energy usage. And you think about that again from a racing perspective. If you're wasting energy having stop starts in your stroke, or having an arm that's coming in too deep, for example, and causing more drag and more surface area for the water to hit, you're slowing yourself down. And no amount of training, or the more training you do and the fitter you become and the faster you swim, the worse it's going to get. The faster you go, the more the drag is going to increase as well. So by ignoring the technical side, you're not actually making the problem better. You're just going faster and having to use more energy to overcome the resistance. So having great technique is such an important part of all of this. And hopefully that has come across in some way in this workshop. So those are kind of the key points. So hopefully this has been helpful. And like I said, it was a challenge for me to kind of put in the most important parts. And hopefully I've got the message across in a positive way. And if there's anything else that you guys need or want to ask questions on, then feel free. But thanks for checking this out, and have a great weekend.